Imagine waking up 10,000 years ago. No phone, no electricity, no supermarket, no hospital. You look outside your tiny shelter, and your biggest problem isn't paying rent, it's finding food before something finds you. But here's the surprising part. Humans weren't simply wandering around terrified all day. They had homes, they had tools, they had families, they had traditions, and in some parts of the world, something enormous was already changing the way humans lived forever. Imagine waking up 10,000 years ago. You open your eyes. There's no alarm clock, no phone, no electricity, no coffee machine, and definitely no delivery app bringing breakfast to your door. Instead, you wake up inside a simple shelter surrounded by the people you live with. Outside, the sun is rising, a fire is slowly dying, and before you can even think about breakfast, there's one question everyone needs answered. Where is today's food coming from? This was the world of humans roughly 10,000 years ago. But here's where things get interesting. There wasn't one single way of life. Different groups lived very differently depending on where they were in the world. Some were still hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants. Others were beginning to settle down and experiment with growing crops and keeping animals. And that slow change would eventually reshape human civilization. British Museum plus one. So let's go back 10,000 years and spend one imaginary day in their world. Morning. The day starts early, not because someone has an important meeting at 8 a.m., because daylight is useful. Your group needs food, water, fuel, and tools. If you're living as a hunter-gatherer, the entire group doesn't necessarily leave together. Different people can perform different tasks depending on the environment, skills, and circumstances. Someone might search for edible plants, someone else might go fishing, others could track animals or collect firewood, and children could learn by watching the adults. The important thing is that food wasn't simply sitting on a supermarket shelf. Humans had to understand their environment. Which plants were safe? Where could water be found? Which animals passed through the area? When was the best season to collect something? This knowledge could mean the difference between eating well and going hungry. And contrary to the popular image of ancient humans eating nothing but meat, archaeological and anthropological evidence shows that human diets were highly variable. Depending on location and season, people could eat plants, fruits, nuts, seeds, fish, shellfish, and hunted animals. There was no universal prehistoric menu. Smithsonian Magazine tools. And then there were tools. You might imagine an ancient human holding one giant stone club. But real prehistoric technology was much more interesting. People made cutting tools, projectile points, scrapers, and many other specialized objects. Flint was particularly useful because it could be fractured to create sharp edges. Those sharp edges could be used for cutting, processing food, and making other tools. Archaeological collections from places such as ancient Egypt show how important worked stone remained during prehistoric periods. The Metropolitan Museum of Art. Think about that. Today, if your kitchen knife breaks, you buy another one. 10,000 years ago, making a useful cutting edge could require skill, patience, and knowledge. A small piece of stone could be incredibly valuable. Where did they live? So where did people sleep? Well, not everyone lived in caves. That's another popular stereotype. Humans used many kinds of shelters depending on their environment. Some groups lived in temporary camps, others built more substantial homes, and some communities were becoming increasingly settled. In fact, archaeology shows that permanent human settlements existed even before agriculture became widespread. One famous example is Ohala II in the region of modern Israel, where researchers found remains of brush huts and hearths dating to around 23,000 years ago. Smithsonian Magazine. So the idea that humans suddenly invented houses when farming began isn't quite right. People had already been experimenting with different ways of living for thousands of years. The fire, now imagine sitting around the fire at night. This might be one of the most important parts of the day. Fire wasn't just about staying warm. It could help with cooking, light, and protection from the cold. And around a fire, people could spend time together. Stories could be told. Knowledge could be passed from one generation to the next. A child could watch an adult make a tool. A young hunter could learn how to track an animal. Someone could remember where a particular plant grew. There was no Google, so knowledge had to live inside people's memories. And that made teaching incredibly important. What about danger? Now let's talk about the part that makes prehistoric life sound terrifying. Danger. Yes, life could be dangerous. Injuries were serious. A bad infection could be devastating. Food supplies could change with seasons. Weather could be unpredictable. And depending on where you lived, wild animals could also pose risks. But there's an important point here. Humans survived. They weren't helpless cavemen constantly running from predators. They had cooperation, tools, fire, knowledge, and social relationships. Humans had already been adapting to different environments for an incredibly long time. So surviving wasn't about being the strongest animal in the forest. It was about being clever enough to work together. And then something changed. Now we reach one of the biggest turning points. Farming. Around this broad period, agriculture was beginning to develop independently in different parts of the world. The transition wasn't one giant event that happened everywhere on the same day. It happened gradually and differently in different regions. The British Museum notes that farming began in several regions, including the Middle East, China, India, and Southeast Asia around 10,000 years ago, while the transition to farming occurred at different times in different places. British Museum imagined discovering that instead of searching for wild plants, you could deliberately grow useful plants near where you lived. Instead of only hunting wild animals, you could begin keeping domesticated animals. That sounds like an obvious improvement, but it wasn't that simple. Farming changed almost everything. People became more connected to particular pieces of land. Communities could become more settled. Forests were cleared for crops. Animals were raised. Food could sometimes be stored, and populations could grow. British Museum +1. But farming also introduced new challenges. People had to work the land. Crops could fail. Stored food could attract pests. And once people became more settled, new social problems could emerge. So the agricultural revolution wasn't simply humans discovered farming and life became perfect. It was much more complicated. The beginning of a new world. Over thousands of years, small communities became increasingly complex. Villages developed. Trade networks expanded. Specialized skills became more important. And eventually, in some regions, villages grew into cities. The Metropolitan Museum of Art describes how communities in the ancient Near East developed from smaller settlements into the first true cities, particularly in Mesopotamia, during the 4th millennium BCE. The Metropolitan Museum of Art. But here's the crazy part. When you're standing inside a tiny prehistoric shelter 10,000 years ago, you don't know any of that is coming. You don't know about cities. You don't know about writing. You don't know about the internet. You don't know about airplanes. You don't know that thousands of years later, humans will walk on the moon. You're simply trying to get through today. Find food, protect your family, keep the fire alive, make another tool, and survive until tomorrow. The biggest surprise. So what was life really like 10,000 years ago? It wasn't simply a miserable existence, and it wasn't some peaceful paradise either. It was complicated. Humans had problems, but they also had families, communities, technology, traditions, creativity, and an incredible ability to adapt. And perhaps the biggest lesson is this. 10,000 years ago, humans weren't finished becoming who we are. They were still experimenting, still adapting, still changing. And some of the decisions made during this period would eventually lead to villages, then cities, then civilizations, and eventually, the world you're living in right now. So the next time you complain because your Wi-Fi is slow, remember, 10,000 years ago, someone had to make a stone tool just to cut dinner, and somehow, they still survived. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, subscribe to PastPulseWorld, because there's a lot more human history hiding behind the world we live in today.